Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to this EMIC webinar. My name is Fiona Costello, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's chat, during which we'll be talking about using generative AI chatbots for mental health. As ChatGPT and other generative AI tools become more widespread, people increasingly use them to work on their mental health. But so far, there is only limited research into why people use it, what it's like to use it, and how it can help. To help us unlock some of these answers, we are joined by a research team from King's College London and Harvard Medical School, who recently submitted for peer review a study to fill this gap. Today, we will hear what they discovered from interviewing 19 people about their real-life experiences using generative AI for mental health. The study's approach of gathering first-hand accounts from users provides invaluable insights into the real-world impact of AI on mental health. By focusing on individual experience and their own unique stories, our panelists were able to uncover nuanced perspectives that quantitative data alone might miss. It's the power of these stories that are going to guide today's session. It just happened to be the perfect thing. I personally think those are such powerful words. And I'm so excited to be joined by the panel today. This is a really exciting topic, but we also recognize that it is a huge topic and that there are likely to be many questions. I'm going to do my best to get to as many as we can, but we're really excited to see today's discussion guide many more conversations into 2025, thinking about all the topics that come up with AI, such as data, privacy, guardrails, capacity building in healthcare. I'm genuinely so excited to see where the conversations lead. So you'll hear from each of our speakers soon, but first I have a few quick points to mention. As always, feel free to share your current location or area of interest. To do so, you can click on the three dots next to your name tag, choose edit and add your country or area. This allows you to connect with others who share similar interests. If you have any questions for the panelists during the webinar, please feel free to post them in the chat box. During the Q&A session, as I've just said, I will do my best to include as many of them as possible in our discussion. And lastly, today's webinar is being recorded and the EMIC team will soon share the recording in the Knowledge Bank. So now it gives me great pleasure to briefly introduce our first speaker, Steve Siddals. Steve is a psychology researcher and technology executive with an academic background in computer science, mathematics, and the psychology and neuroscience of mental health, and 25 years of experience leading technology transformation for multinationals. Steve recently led a qualitative study to explore real-life experiences of using generative AI chatbots such as ChatGPT for mental health. He is passionate about leveraging technology to address the global mental health crisis and looking forward to connecting with many experts, leaders, and innovators in this exciting space. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited. Over to you.
Thank you, Fiona, for the introduction and for so perfectly setting the scene. It's a curious feature of the times we live in that if you're suffering and if you have an internet connection, you can open up a browser, head to ChatGPT, Pi, or Gemini, or any other of these frontier generative AI chatbots, and just start talking about whatever's on your mind. And the chances are you're going to have a conversation that feels compassionate and empathic and helpful. And that could be a big deal, which is why John and Astrid and I conducted this study, which is currently under peer review. We wanted to talk to people who were doing exactly that, and we wanted to find out what it's like. So before I tell you what we found, let's do a quick poll here, if we can. I think there's a poll that's been prepared, and I think you'll see it in the chat. And I'm interested in two things. First of all, for everyone on the call, have you tried using one of these generative AI chatbots for emotional or mental health support? And secondly, if you have, did you find it helpful? So hopefully you'll see it somewhere in the chat. Yeah, vote, and we'll add up the scores and let you know at some point. In the meantime, I'm going to share my screen and show you what we found. All right. So in our study, we interviewed 19 people. They were aged between 17 and 60 years old, and slightly more men than women, from 8 countries across the world. And they basically all volunteered to tell us about their experiences with generative AI. They've been focusing on a variety of topics: anxiety, depression, stress, conflict, dealing with loss, mostly using Pi, which is the chatbot that's kind of most positioned as a warm, supportive coach, but also ChatGPT and others, with the majority of participants using it several times a week or more as their peak usage, and most participants reporting positive impact on their lives. So I'm just going to move the poll from my screen so I can see what I'm sharing with you. Okay. So what I'd really like to do, though, is tell you a few of their stories. Meet Air a 44-year-old actor in the US who experienced a perfect storm. His business collapsed, his marriage fell apart, and his mother became seriously ill, leaving him alone in a quiet house, wondering at 2 in the morning who to call. He turned to the chatbot Pi, which accompanied him through the whole journey with compassion and empathy and space to talk, but also with insights into what had happened. He told me that Pi told him things about himself that weren't easy to hear, but that he wanted to know. And he said the experience was life-changing, profound, and that with Pi's help, he became okay again. Meet Brooklyn, a 19-year-old student in the UK who turned to ChatGPT after experiencing the loss of her first serious romantic relationship, which a year later she wasn't getting over. And worse, she was starting to lose interest at school. She felt that talking about it to her friends and family was starting to become a burden to them. Brooklyn was very much into fiction, and she'd asked ChatGPT to assemble a room of characters from her favorite TV horror series. And she talked through her feelings, getting diverse perspectives, a cynical one from this character, a hopeful one from that one. And she also co-created fictional scenarios that mirrored her struggles and gave her new perspectives. And through this process, she was able to move on from the pain of the breakup and rediscover her joy and her confidence in her studies. Meet Isabel, a 40-year-old small business owner in China who had developed anxiety disorder 2 years previously, seemingly out of nowhere. She turned to ChatGPT to understand her diagnosis. And after many conversations, ChatGPT suggested that she read a book called Toxic Parents, which she did. And she realized her father probably has narcissistic personality disorder, her mother, borderline. And not to go into details, but this is not a good environment to grow up in. Isabel told me one day she asked ChatGPT, if the dad is narcissistic and the mum's borderline, and the older sister is the golden child, then who's the younger sister? And ChatGPT told her, well, that would be the scapegoat. She spent 2 months talking to ChatGPT every day for 4 or 5 hours a day, just trying to make sense of it all. The violence, the painful and traumatic memories of her childhood, adolescence, 20s, 30s. She told me that it felt like after 38 years of suffering, she now understands her family, accepts the reality, and found the freedom to keep a safe distance from her parents without being paralyzed by guilt, which gave her space to complete her second master's degree, start her small business, and that this experience totally changed her life. There were so many other inspiring and insightful stories that our participants shared with us. The 60-year-old man struggling with depression, who, after talking with Pi every day for a year, developed confidence to reach out to others and start therapy with a human. Or the young man from the Uyghur community in China, where therapists are hard to find, who use Pi to make sense of family conflicts and get advice on relationships. Overall, our participants told us that generative AI feels like an emotional sanctuary. It's validating, it's non-judgmental, it's always there, but the guardrails, which were designed to keep it safe, can hit you like a harsh rejection. And this was a problem for a majority of our participants who told us several stories of sharing something raw and sensitive with the chatbot and receiving a scripted response along the lines of, I can't help you with that. Please contact a professional, or this violates our policy. And ironically, that was the closest thing to harm that our participants experienced in the whole interaction with the chatbot, which suggests we need a more sophisticated paradigm for AI chatbot safety. They told us that it provides insightful guidance, valued advice, and new perspectives, but some participants worried, will it challenge me enough? They told us that it can be a joy to connect with, and that it feels quite different from traditional rule-based mental health chatbots, which can feel rigid, impersonal, predictable, and frustrating. But they wondered, is it accessible enough to people who are less tech aware? And finally, they used it instead of and alongside human therapy, sometimes in quite creative and surprising ways, but they noticed it doesn't lead the therapeutic process. You have to take a lot of responsibility for your own therapeutic journey. Now, if these experiences are widespread, then we may have a powerful new entrant into the landscape of options for people who are struggling with their mental health that has distinctive new positioning. So compared with rule-based chatbots, it's more engaging, it understands you more deeply, it gives better quality advice, and it's more flexible to respond to your needs. But compared with human therapy, it's always there for you. It costs nothing if you use the free versions of these tools. It feels less judgmental. And we had participants say, I know my therapist doesn't judge me, but I know my therapist is human, and of course they judge me. And that was powerful for a lot of, for many of our participants. And it allows for creative new use cases, not just the harnessing of the power of fiction that we saw in Brooklyn's story, but our participants also used generative AI chatbots to create powerful symbolic imagery. One participant created a picture of a tree growing in the desert. It was an image that was powerful for her and made it the lock screen on her phone. Or for example, to asked generative AI to read through and provide insights into real conflicts they'd experienced. So if all of that sounds exciting to you, then great. Because to realize this opportunity is going to need a whole collaboration from researchers who can help us understand and quantify how effective is this, from developers who can help find ways to make this more accessible to everyone, not just the tech savvy, from clinicians who can start to explore how could this augment or support their patients, or maybe just start trying it out themselves to get some familiarity for when the questions come from patients. And finally, from policymakers who can help to balance the risk of recommending something as uncontrolled and unpredictable as generative AI against the reward of providing meaningful support to those who currently have none. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining the call and for your interest. I can't wait to hear all your questions. And back to you, Fiona. And I don't know if there's a way to see the results of the. Okay, I think. Is there a way to see the results of the poll? Okay, I'm not seeing it on my screen. We'll come back to the results of the poll later. So yeah, thanks very much, and back to you, Fiona.
Thank you. Right, so I'll start again. Thank you, Steve, very much for that really insightful overview of the research. And you asked at the very beginning, how do you feel about generative AI? We asked, have you tried using generative AI for emotional and mental health support? 35% of you said yes, 65% of you said no. And for those of you who said yes, 69% of you said that you did find it helpful, and 31% of you said that you didn't find it helpful. So I think, as Steve said, we're really keen to have your questions. So we're going to move on to the next speaker, but please do continue to put your questions through to the chat, and I will try not to join on mute next time. So our second speaker is Astrid Coxon, Senior Research Associate at the University of East Anglia and Online Teaching Fellow at King's College London. Astrid is Senior Research Associate at the University of East Anglia Health Policy Research and an online teaching fellow, as I just said, at King's, with an MSc in Psychology and Neuroscience of Mental Health, Introduction to Implementation Science. Astrid specializes in qualitative research methods and realist evaluation, and her previous research experience includes exploring ambulance dispatch workers, experiences of work-related stress, the implementation of enhanced recovery pathways for hip fracture patients with dementia, and improving the use of technology-enhanced learning practices for higher education students with specific learning differences. Astrid is also a chartered psychologist and person-centered psychotherapist in private practice, working predominantly online with clients, and has a growing interest in the debates around the use of AI tools within therapeutic work. Really excited to hear your insights, Astrid. I will now pass over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm only going to speak for a couple of minutes just to introduce myself and give a little bit of context to my involvement with the study. When Steve first came to me with the idea for this research as part of his master's in psychology and neuroscience and mental health at King's, I was really excited because I have a very armchair understanding of generative AI, but I've found it very interesting and experimenting with it. But the picture in psychotherapy is quite mixed at the moment. There are other psychotherapists like myself who are very interested and integrate it into their practice. I saw in the chat, Sally Ann, I think you said you created an AI tool that you use with clients, which is really exciting. But there are also a lot of psychotherapists who find the concept of generative AI being used as a tool to help people to work on their own mental health as a quite threatening prospect, and something that has a lot of risk inherent in it. Now, I think it potentially could be quite short-sighted or maybe even a bit patronizing to think that clients maybe don't have the skills or the knowledge to be able to navigate these tools themselves. As Steve's highlighted, it doesn't necessarily stop with the generative AI as well. There are plenty of clients that use these tools as a gateway drug to speaking to human therapists, and plenty of clients that I work with as well will use generative AI tools between sessions and bring that material to sessions to discuss, okay, whilst we were between sessions, I was thinking about the things you said and I wanted to explore it further, but I wasn't sure where to start. So I talked to ChatGPT and this is what we came out with, and it can be really great grounds for ongoing discussion and work. I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say, both in terms of where this could go, but also concerns. So yeah, I will leave it there and look forward to having a fuller discussion between Steve, John, and myself. So Fiona, I will hand back to you, and I look forward to taking the conversation further.
Thank you so much, Astrid. Okay, and our final speaker is John Torres. John Torres, MD, MBI, is Director of the Digital Psychiatry Division at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, a Harvard Medical School affiliated hospital where he also serves as a staff psychiatrist and assistant professor. He is the Medical Director of Behavioral Health Informatics for Beth Israel Lahey Health. With a background in electrical engineering and computer sciences, Dr. Torres completed his medical education at UC San Diego and Harvard. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles on mobile mental health technologies and directs the Digital Psychiatry Clinic at BIDMC. He also serves as editor-in-chief of JMIR Mental Health and chairs the APA's Health IT Committee. John, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Steve, of course, for leading the research, and Astrid as well. I think what's really interesting in talking about this topic, and again, Stephen gave us a lot of interesting use cases. It's certainly not every interaction is positive, many are. And if I think back just even a couple of weeks, we had one patient in our emergency department, and usually it says, why does a person have to come to the emergency department for psychiatry? This one was ChatGPT told patient to come. And I think this person was chatting with it, and ChatGPT decided that there was some level of risk and told the person to call emergency services for an evaluation. Emergency services brought the person to the hospital. We did an evaluation and figured out the person was not at risk. They did not have a psychiatric disorder. They could go home. But it was certainly the first case where it wasn't that someone had suicidal thoughts or wasn't feeling well. It was ChatGPT said I should come. But in the data that Stephen shared, there's kind of a couple core issues that really come to what does it mean to have a mental illness or not, and what does it mean to get treatment? In essence, the cases of, right, what is a level of normal distress where it's helpful to have a therapeutic conversation with someone? What is the level of distress where you need a professional to help you in? And where is that gray, red, where is that thin line of what needs professional help and what needs conversation? I think we all know that conversations are helpful and therapeutic. Talking to people is helpful. It's an interesting one of what is that gray line and where does it go? And it's going to be different for different people in different cultures. It also in some ways does get to, though, the issue of what does it mean to deliver treatment or therapy as a provider? If you were to ask a surgeon, kind of what does a surgeon do? They'd say, like, I cut with a scalpel. If you ask a therapist, kind of what is our tool? We would likely say words. Words and the therapeutic alliance is what we do and what we can offer. And clearly here we're seeing these different chatbots offering words to some extent. And I think the question is, where do those words, again, from a clinical point of view, become therapeutic? Do we need a therapeutic alliance with the delivering of these? Is it enough to just kind of give that combination of conversations to people? So on both ends, we kind of have these mysteries of, again, what is a mental illness? We're not going to solve it on this webinar. And then what does it mean to get treatment? But I think when you wrap up the interesting technology and innovation in these chatbots with these kind of broad issues that have kind of never been settled in the field, it really does become a topic that is of broad interest to everyone for very good reasons, because it's more than just even the cases that were fascinating that Stephen presented. So I think as we think about these different ways it could work, there's a lot of conversations to have. So maybe I'll be quiet for now and hand it over so we can begin to have some of those conversations of such an interesting global diverse audience here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for your reflections. Astrid, Steve, if you can come back, and then we can sort of kick off with some questions. Hello. I'm going to start with the audience questions, and then we can start to get going on a conversation. But one of the questions from Mike is, how do we educate and support people who aren't digitally literate to look for support with their mental health through generative AI chatbots? And when they do, how to use them effectively? I really resonate with this content, with this question. I use ChatGPT a lot. I use equivalents of ChatGPT a lot. And I think very often it's the art of the prompt. If you don't ask a good question, you won't get good feedback. So in the context of mental health, how do we go on that journey of education with patients? And also, should we? I think that big question, and I will allow you, well, I'll let you kind of come in there and then maybe ask some more.
Steve, do you want to start on this? Because I know you have some ideas as to where this could go next.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a really central question, because if it turns out that these tools are as powerful as this small study suggests they might be, then getting them into the hands of people who need them is really like going to be critical. It will make the difference between do they help or not. And there's a couple of elements to this, right? So one of the astonishing features of these chatbots is they're extraordinarily accessible because you can just chat with them, even with your voice. You wouldn't even need to type. It could be, it could feel as simple as having a voice conversation. And at the same time, there's this hurdle of like, how do you get to it? How do you install it? Which website do you go to? How do you, so there is still a technical barrier, even though you don't need to learn how to use it necessarily. There's no complex buttons to click on. You still need to know how to get to it. And we have participants say like, I think my mum could use this, but like, it's just how do I get her to start? And on the other hand, there's the question of maybe not so much digital literacy, but more like, is it mental health literacy? Is it like understanding what is it that you're talking to? So that this point about prompting that Fiona mentioned is like, what do I say to it? And I think as we get more research into how it works, we can maybe also start to inspire people with transcripts and stories and just sharing like this is how people are using it, and it starts to become a better known thing. You see it more and more in newspapers, you see it more online, but I think it's one of these things that you try it, you hear other people say they've used it, and you get experience with it, and you build a model of what is this thing, and through that you kind of start to learn what really helps and how to use it.
Because I think until you brought this research idea to me, I hadn't even considered using a chatbot to talk about my problems. I didn't. I asked it general knowledge questions or refreshers on things that I'd forgotten, but to actually go, I'm struggling with this. Can you talk it through with me? Was an idea that I hadn't considered, and I wonder how many other people also don't consider it. Do they just use ChatGPT to write song lyrics in the style of whatever as a fun thing to do, rather than okay, what are the and I think the idea of creating a repository of people's experiences of this could be a really useful way to prompt people to go, okay, well, maybe that's something I could approach it with. I hadn't considered that.
I think an interesting aspect too is we are assuming people can use the computer and internet, which most people can and are getting access to it. But there's likely a group of people with some broad digital literacy training of how to access the internet, how to use Wi-Fi versus your data plan, that maybe, again, don't even realize ChatGPT yet exists, or they've heard about it but not played with it. And I think if all of us remember, say, getting our first smartphone and being so excited and using it a lot, maybe we all still overuse it, but I think if we can bring people into these ecosystems for the first time, again, maybe it's people who are older, maybe it's people with serious mental illness, sometimes people we don't think are going to become users, they may become really excited and kind of in some ways the super users of it. So I think the population is not using it today may actually become the ones that can benefit from the most. And these are teachable things, right? There's no special knowledge needed, but you kind of need someone elbow to elbow sometimes to help you.
Mm.
And it prompts another question in my mind, Steve, which reflects on some of the language you use, which is that it's not digital literacy, it's mental health literacy. And kind of, coming for like working in mental health for a while, obviously we talk about recovery and we talk about a strengths-based approach. But if you don't have that background, what does that look like? And did your participants in the research talk about their journey in terms of how they started to talk and potentially how their language changed as they were engaging with the generative AI chatbots?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Fiona. That was one quite striking thing that came out. I would say the digital literacy was quite high of the participant sample, and the mental health literacy not so much. I think most of the participants were coming at this from a tech angle, and then discovered that this tool they were using for coding support or other more sort of common use cases had this power. I had a participant say one of the most powerful impacts for him was that it gave him a whole new language to talk about and make sense of his emotions. So he went in with, I think, quite low mental health literacy, and at some point his partner was like, how do you know all these terms, and like how do you talk with so much clarity on on these like sensitive and subtle topics of the emotional and the inner world, and it was because, you know, he'd been through this process.
That's interesting. So it's almost acting not only as a comforting mechanism in that moment when you're having that conversation, but also educating, and then that element of peer support where it's then directly influencing their interactions with people in their world. So therefore having a kind of a butterfly effect, which I guess from
Yeah.
a prevention, early intervention, kind of just general approach to mental health and well-being presents some really interesting possibilities again in terms of how we kind of can educate and empower people to be comfortable talking about their mental health. Asha, John, did you have any reflections on that from your perspective in terms of that kind of that strengthening that peer support element and how people can then kind of talk to their loved ones and kind of have that education impact?
I'll briefly say we know that, to use a jargony word, psychoeducation, or just understanding the basics of mental health, that's so important for better mental health and for reducing stigma, to give everyone information and facts about the illness. And I think we can argue about, can this be a therapist? Can it not be a therapist? Does it have alliance? But I think we can all agree that giving people accurate facts about these treatments, that recovery is possible, what they are, that seems like a win. And again, we can talk about bias in a second, but usually these bots are pretty good at giving out standard facts. And if we can share facts about mental illness, and again, that recovery is possible of treatment, that seems like a tremendous win for everyone.
Yeah, I don't have so much knowledge of the back end of AI, but I know that people have used the word hallucinations in the chat. I don't know if you have any more to tell us about what is the rate of hallucination in terms of facts that Gen AI bots are giving out to people. Is there a risk that they're giving false information?
Well, I think Steve and I have looked at this, and it really goes back to what they're trained on. And again, so it's what is the source of truth for their facts? And a lot of these things seem to go to Wikipedia as the source of truth. A lot of them will go to social media like Reddit as the source of truth. So certainly there's going to be some untruths, I should say lies, right? To be direct, that are going to be put into this. But I think if they're usually, it seems that things have been, facts again usually seem to be better if it kind of says what is depression. Again, I think it's a little harder if it's trying to interpret what does depression mean for John in the context of the weather and season changing. And John, so I think if you get the context becomes specific, it's harder. But if we're giving out facts, I think the information is out there. There is good information on the internet about what are these illnesses, and these bots have read it. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes potentially it could be more accurate than human therapists. I know I'm at risk of being lambasted by my peers on making a comment like that, but I do see psychoeducation being passed around amongst the psychotherapeutic community that is factually incorrect. But because people are going to a therapist to see a professional, it can be very easy to be lulled into, well, this is a professional person, they know what they're talking about, and not look any further. And I don't see how that is any more dangerous than potentially a generative AI bot saying, okay, well, this is a fact.
And the one thing I'd add to this is, I guess this is not something I've researched and confirmed, but from all my experience in this, it looks like mental health might be an unusually good use case for generative AI from the context of hallucination. Because if you ask it for something very specific and factual, can you give me the name of a research paper that looks into this that was in this year? It will make one up for you every time, because you want something specific and it will say something plausible. But if you want to talk about human suffering, and even very specific to your circumstances, this is it was trained on Wikipedia, but it was also trained on every novel ever made available, every psychology paper and handbook ever published, every transcript of a conversation that was helpful. And it's taking the best of all of these and applying it to your situation. And so the hallucination thing, when you want really concrete facts, is a problem. But the kind of, to John's point at the beginning, the sort of words that therapists use as part of treatment, tend to be more about like receiving the emotional and giving you clarity on the internal processes, and that's something that's less at risk from hallucination.
Yeah.
Steve, I just want to, and I'm trying to keep up with the chat at the same time, but I just wanted to ask one question. It does play into a comment that someone's made, but when we think about digital mental health, and when we think about ChatGPT, you obviously have been interviewing 19 different users from around the world. What was their experience of the cultural sensitivity? Because there are arguments to say that actually a lot of that data is rooted in westernized approaches. It's a common issue with digital health technologies that they're not able to reflect the cultural nuance, the language that people use to describe their mental health and well-being. Is there in the work that you've done, is there some kind of indication that actually ChatGPT and other generative AI does have that capability because of the fact that it's generating, so it's kind of reflecting back the language the user is using and then using that to prompt different data sources coming in?
Yeah, this question of what culture are you interacting with when you have these kind of conversations it's really interesting. And I'll just tell you two things that came up in the study and one thing that I read separately. So I had a participant in Russia who said, talking to ChatGPT, or Pi, it's a bit like having a conversation with somebody from California. You're going to get the values and you're going to get the worldview, and it's, you can locate it. And for me, that was fine, he said, but I think there are people in my life who wouldn't like that. The story of Isabel that I shared, there was one of the most transformational things for her was giving herself permission to have safe distance from her parents. And she talked directly to ChatGPT about this and what's reasonable and what should I do? Do I need to be in contact with my parents? She'd been fighting for many years to try and build a relationship with her father, and she couldn't see it was going to happen. And with a narcissistic personality disorder diagnosis, it looked even less likely. She said, ChatGPT gave me the permission to have this safe distance, and that changed everything. And in my culture, she said, in China, nobody would have told me that. Everybody I know would have said, you need to be in close contact with your parents. They brought you up. You need to accept their authority. That even in cases of violence, you need to. So in a sense, for her, it was the cultural difference from her own culture that she found helpful. But she also said, to implement that in her world, she needed to talk. She needed therapy, human therapy locally. So it's like ChatGPT told me the thing I needed to do, and my local therapist told me how to do it. And there's a similar example there's an amazing paper from a team, Song et al. On a similar topic, large language models for therapy, where they had a participant, I think from the Middle East, who said a similar thing. The participant was, I think, gender fluid in some way, and said, like, in my culture, it would be hard to get these conversations that I'm having, but at the same time, I often feel like the chatbot doesn't understand where I'm coming from at all, and tells me things that would not make sense at all where I live. So I think there's a gap here. And the question is, could you prompt it? Could you tell it, this is the kind of culture I want you to work from? And would it have enough training data to do that? And I haven't tried that, but I'd be fascinated to see if that works.
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? It's kind of moving past those cultural boundaries to create that safe space to have conversations that otherwise you might not be able to have. But equally being able to frame it within your context to be able to then drive action, and there being that real subtle balance, which I think comes back to person-centered care and you as the individual kind of driving your own kind of approach, I guess, in terms of what's comfortable. I'm aware that the chat is going wild, so I'm now going to go back to the webinar chat to ask some questions. So, presenters, what are your experience in ethics approval for research involving AI and people with mental health concerns?
Yeah, we had to be really careful about this, didn't we, Steve? Because yeah, working with vulnerable people it can create ethical risks. So we had to be very careful about how we framed the participant group and how we framed what we were looking at. Steve, I'm aware I've just leapt straight on this, and this is your baby, as I keep saying. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
I think I would say yeah, for our study, it wasn't too difficult to address the ethical risks because we were not asking people to use these. We were talking to people who had already started, and it was a question of please, share your experiences with us. We needed to do that, as Astrid said, in a way that was, very clear what we were asking for consent for, what we would do with the data, and also to make sure that the conversations were going to be safe conversations and that we knew what to do if the conversations became, too charged. But I think there's a more broad ethical question, which is it safe to ask people or to suggest to people that they use these? And that's something where we just really need that research. We didn't see any examples of harm. But we also know that chatbots are hard to predict what they're going to say, and I think one angle we took on, I touched on the guardrails question as a seemingly not that effective way to make these safe. And one angle I'd love to see research on here is to what extent does having a really good understanding of what you're talking to help to protect you from the risk of harm? Because it's not obvious. Like, what is this AI? Is it a consciousness? Is it just a computer program that somebody wrote? Where does it come from? How is it responding like this? And what if it goes off the rails? What if it says something that I don't like, or that I know is not true, or that I find not helpful? So there's something about giving people the power rather than using guardrails to sort of block the potential harmful things, giving people the power to interpret what they're saying so they can use their own critical faculty, and as you would with a therapist. But it's difficult because, as Astrid said, it's vulnerable populations, and how do you support and empower but still kind of keep safe?
Yes, there's a paper I read from a team at University of East London, and they had this concept of digital health atmosphere. And the idea was basically each person creates their own meaning of using these tools, right? So I may form a very strong connection and value it. You, for whatever reasons, may not trust technology and form it, but it becomes a very personal experience. And understanding what people bring into it, and are they able to build that relationship in a context where the advice is trust or not trust, it's a very interesting one. If we each have our kind of own atmosphere, some of us clearly can benefit, and I think your cases really show it works well. And it's different. And I think we'll learn as a field who these can help today and who we can train to maybe help them, who can kind of build a conducive atmosphere towards it. So I'm still grappling with this idea, but it's a very cool idea.
Another question is curious whether client-patient facing generative chatbots versus clinician-facing chatbots differ in terms of design and implementation. Are they equally effective for both users?
I haven't seen that many clinician-facing chatbots or personally use them. I imagine they're doing what's called, to be jargony, clinical decision support. They're saying, hey, you should think of this medicine or this thing next. A lot of medical records have had those kind of alerts pop up. And if anything, there's been alert fatigue in the field where people go, the medical record tries to tell me to do too many things. I just need to do what I need to do. But I think those could certainly be guiding people towards better clinical decisions. I imagine those are closer to decision trees, right? Because as a medical rule, it says, if John says to do this and it's contraindicated, give John an alert of what to do. So I think a lot of what we've been talking about is the more patient-facing ones, tools that can be used to augment and extend care.
So do you think then that from a blended therapy approach that what you could have is you could have your interaction with the clinician, whether that's digital, whether it's face to face, but that actually this could be a really helpful tool to reinforce concepts and themes that are coming through that sort of that therapeutic connection, regardless of how it's being delivered. And in that case, potentially accelerate recovery or add that kind of bit of self-determination in the journey. What do you think?
I'm not a betting person, but If I had to guess, I think in a couple of years, hybrid or these blended care models will be the future of outpatient therapy and psychiatry. Because, right, you're giving people the best of face-to-face, be it telehealth or in person, but they're using the tools outside of care. So there's that asynchronous telehealth meets the synchronous telehealth, and that becomes, as you said, found a blended or hybrid care models. And it seems like in some ways you do get the best of both worlds, right? You get the access and scalability of technology with the expertise and guidance and personalization of a clinician. I think, though, to make hybrid blended care work, you gotta, as we talked about, help clinicians, you gotta teach them. You have now two customers. You have the clinicians and you have the patients, and that means you need patient-centered design, but also clinician-centered design means relationship-centered design. And a lot of these tools are not yet made for true integration into care settings. They can be, and they should be, and they will be.
Astra, do you have some reflections on that? Because I know that when we had a sort of a discussion prior to this panel, we were talking about, was there a danger of almost creating a two-tier approach to healthcare where you've got one group going over here and another group going over there, and what that meant for kind of people's trust and confidence in healthcare systems overall? And what do you think the appetite would be from sort of therapists in terms of that blended care model, and what steps do we need to take to get people comfortable with that as an idea?
I think that the stories like the research that we've produced could potentially build some confidence on both sides in these sorts of approaches to therapy. Just because having anecdotally spoken to other therapists who are maybe a bit skeptical about the role of generative AI in supporting people's mental health, they just have never used them. They just go, well, it's just a chatbot, isn't it? You can't replace a human. But I remember when I was first training, and I had always wanted to work remotely with people because I work in a bit of a niche, and I know that potentially I'm not going to be able to, or clients aren't going to be potentially be able to access me face to face. So I've always wanted to work remotely, even before COVID. But when I was first floating that idea with peers, I had people say, but that's not real therapy, is it? And I think we're at the same sort of crossroads here, where potentially people are going, well, this isn't really therapeutic, is it? How could it possibly replace therapy? And I don't think it should necessarily replace therapy, but like Steve's highlighted with some of the participants' stories, it can augment or even lead into more traditional means of therapy. I don't think it's one replace the other, but as John said, it potentially leads to hybrid designs or training models for therapists and for clients alike, exercising what it is like to talk to people about challenging content, whether you are a client who's never spoken to someone about their distress before, or whether you are a trainee therapist potentially. Could I don't know, could generative AI tools be used as practice clients, as a way for trainee therapists to practice in a safe way?
Really, really interesting. How important, Steve, I think this is a question for you. How important do you think evaluating user acceptance is in the implementation development of generative AI? What theories based on past technology acceptance come to mind?
Ooh. User acceptance is so important. And if you look across the long journey of digital mental health, the promise has been there from the start that this is something that could be always available in your pocket, low cost, and could really drive a change, drive a significant change in the availability and accessibility of high quality care. And one of the challenges has been it's just hard to keep people using them. What really excites me about this study is, and obviously it's qualitative and it's a sample of 19, but the sense you get is that this is totally different. So in an industry that's really struggled to have high user acceptance and high engagement, people are saying, people are showing extraordinarily high engagement. When you're working 5 hours a day for 2 months on this, you start to think, is that, could that be too much? And I think in the cases we saw, it wasn't. It was people doing very intense, focused work because they needed to. And when they were done with the work, they were done with spending the time with the chatbot. But yeah, we're seeing really high levels of engagement. I would love to know if that's specific to the sample size, or if that's something more widespread as a feature. But one thing that speaks that it might be is a lot of these folks had tried the kind of chatbots that are out there, the digital rule-based ones and found them, not too satisfying. So it's populations who have experienced it, who know what low engagement looks like for digital mental health, and then tried these and found them a different level of engagement. So it doesn't quite answer your question which frameworks, but I think, like, to begin with, I would just love to see some qualitative research to say, for people who start to use these use cases, just how much are they using it, and how much is it giving them a sense of satisfaction and a sense that it's helping. And then we can start to unpack, what is it about it, and that's important as well. Like, what are the prompts that help, and what are the ways to use it that keep it useful? But to begin with, I would really just love to know, like, is this really a step change from the kinds of things we've been seeing so far?
The next question. Thank you for sharing these insights. I think we can all agree with saying thank you. My question is, how can we improve what chatbots can safely do? E.g., do they need more data, more guardrails, more oversight? Who wants to answer that one? Yeah.
No one.
They need, when we say more data, they need worlds of more data. Like these things are very data hungry. They learn by simple pattern recognition. And it is simple, but imagine if you show, they just need millions, if not billions, sometimes trillions of patterns. So I think they can get better. And I think, but one of the challenges, where do billions of examples come from? And where do billions of examples that are consistent come from? So I think the biggest challenge is, what do I call depression versus Astrid versus Steve based on our train? Like, if we can't all agree that this is depression or this is anxiety, this poor chatbot just saying, give me an example of what is depression. And we're going, no, this is it, this is it. So I do think we can make a lot of inroads in language, because language has rules, right? There's actually books that perhaps I should read myself of all the rules of English grammar. It tells you exactly where the period and comma has to go. And chatbots love that because they love rules. But again, when we get to mental health, we all know that we don't have great rules for defining mental health. I'm not here to say that DSM is best, ICD-10 is best. It's hard. So I think that we are going to reach a challenge of, how do we get enough examples that we all agree on? But I think the language, it can do well, and that's what we're seeing. It can talk, and we know that talking is therapeutic. So I think you've hit on one of the upcoming challenges for these systems in their growth.
Yeah, and there's maybe just two small things I would add to that. This question, do we need more data? It speaks to a very sort of surprising fact about these tools, which is they were never even designed for mental health use cases. No one fed them with a data set that's, mental health specific. The folks who built them, I don't think even expected that they would be able to do this. And they're having, like, you see across the whole generative AI space, that these tools have these emergent properties that nobody expected, as a simple consequence of the fact that, as John said, they've digested 1 trillion words of information that's, more or less everything ever published by humanity that's available on the internet. And that gives them a level of depth of understanding that's remarkable. And so the point I would say is, giving them more data probably will make them even more powerful. But at this stage, what's interesting is, it seems like they already have the property to be helpful. And so the focus for now is maybe less on more, do we need to give them more data, and more on how do we get them to people who need them, and also how do we better understand what they're good at, because it's controlling them with guardrails is not working too well. But how do you make them safe in a way that people can get the benefits without risking unwanted consequences?
And maybe digging deeper into trying to understand, what is the mechanism of action here? Because we've had these conversations in research in traditional psychotherapy for years and years and years about what's the most effective mode of therapy. And there is a dodo bird effect, right? There's essentially, they all work to a certain extent, but it might not be because of the particular the modality, that it might be some third factor. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe it's not because it's giving correct information or because it's approaching it a particular way, but because people can go to this reliable chatbot who is always there when they need them and responds to them in a way that feels supportive and non-judgmental. And for some people, that might be just the perfect thing. But yes, maybe we need to dig deeper with how we research this to understand, well, what is it that is making the difference for people with this? What is it that is therapeutic about it?
We have 4 minutes left. As predicted, there are lots and lots of questions. There's going to be some fairly unhappy attendees that we couldn't get to them all. So my apologies, but as you can see, and as we said at the beginning, this is a really big topic, but I do want to come back to it just happened to be the perfect thing. We started this webinar talking about people's stories, why AI was able to help them in that particular moment, and the way in which they felt that through that conversation, they felt empowered to talk to their loved ones about how they were feeling, but also to have that inner conversation with themselves and in a way that made them feel happier and more comfortable. And I think we can all agree that ultimately, if that's how it makes someone feel, then that's a good thing. Having said that, though, there are many, many, many things that we need to discuss still when it comes to AI. We've talked about data, we've talked about guardrails, we've talked about potentially issues from a cultural sensitivity perspective. There are lots and lots of professional issues from a boundaries perspective in terms of how does this influence the role of a therapist? How does a therapist get comfortable? These are huge, huge topics. And as I said at the beginning, this will work our way into 2025 in terms of a different set of webinars that cover each of these topics. And we will go back through the questions and we will give each of the questions some time moving into the new year. But I don't normally do this, but in the last kind of 2 or 3 minutes, Asha, Steve, we're so honoured to have you with us today. I would love to give you the final words and just say, of all the things that you're thinking with regards to the next piece of this journey, what is going to be your focus and takeaway from today's webinar? Astrid, you can go first.
I would love to focus on supporting psychotherapists to become more comfortable with something that is here and here to stay, because people can be as resistant as they like, but clients are going to continue using these tools and use them increasingly. So getting psychotherapists to feel at least familiar with, if not comfortable with, these tools, so that they can feel less threatened by or even integrate them into a practice, I think is something that I'm really interested in.
Amazing. And John, for you?
I think similar to what Astrid said, right? People are using these already. The cases show that this is happening. But so I think the question is not approaching as a theoretical of saying, what do I need to know today? And I think there are educational resources, but then keeping track of it, because if you don't love the things we said today, right, you can advocate for it to change. It's early stages. If you like where it's going, you can advocate. But I think all of us can have a voice. But it's definitely starting. It doesn't seem to be rolling backwards. So this isn't one of those things where you go, this is an academic niche topic, let me forget about it. It's starting, but it's at the early stages, and it can go left or right depending on where you push it to.
And Steve.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for these amazing questions, and also thanks to everyone for participating in the poll, because there's something very interesting there, right? We had, I think it was 35% of this group have tried this, and that is so encouraging. It's such a not obvious thing to try using generative AI or a computer at all for. And I think I know this is not a random sample of the population, but that a third of us have given it a try is great. I think 70% found it useful. That's great as well. And I just want, to echo what Astrid and John said. This is here right now. This is available. People are using it, and people could be using it so much more. So I think the opportunity is enormous. And I know people join this call for different reasons, but if you feel inspired to get involved, then get in touch, reach out, because we just love to collaborate on finding ways to bring this opportunity to the people who could really use it.
Thank you so, so, so much. I feel like we could have gone on a lot longer today. I'm so grateful to all three of you for your contributions and for the insight and for the really profound questions. To the audience, again, I am so sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but we will come to them as EMIC. I think it presents some really good questions following Congress around capacity building, acceptance from the profession. We're really, really very grateful for you to join us, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.